We do apologize for the delay to this service. We are aware that you have a choice of podcasts and very much appreciate that you have today again chosen the history of the Germans.
Hello and welcome to the History of the Germans, episode 210. Ladislaus Postumus, Lord of all, ruler of no one, which is also episode 8 of season 11, The Fall and Rise of the House of Habsburg. Our journey today will take us away from the Emperor Friedrich III, who will spend most of the episode holed up in his castle at Wiener Neustadt, fretting and gardening. Instead, we will look at the dramatic life of his younger cousin, Ladislaus Postumus, King of Hungary, King of Bohemia and Archduke of Austria. And this will take us back to Prague and its complex religious politics, to Vienna, where the people fall for the alluring promises of a populist, and to Hungary, where one of the greatest generals of the age squares up against Mehmet II, the conqueror of Constantinople. But before we start, a quick reminder that the history of the Germans is not solely driven by my mojo, but by the generosity of our patrons, and you can become a patron too by signing up on historyofthegermans.com/support. And then I want to say special thanks to Mats H., Anne J., Henry W., Thierry N., Klaus K., Alucard Z., and Dan, who've already signed up at historyofthegermans.com/support. With that, back to the show. Now, last week we ended on Friedrich III's journey to Rome, a journey that brought him the imperial crown and a wife, Eleanor of Portugal. Now, there is no free lunch, in particular, no free lunch with the Pope. The price Friedrich paid for scepter and spouse was to throw the imperial church under the not yet existing bus. He signed the Vienna Concordat, the treaty that would define papal-imperial relations for the next 350 years. While France, England and other kingdoms had long negotiated agreements to keep Rome at arm's length, limiting papal say in church appointments and the flow of funds, Friedrich's deal granted the Pope a lot. The Pope could overturn local elections of bishops and abbots if he felt another candidate was more worthy or worth more. Cash flowed more freely to Rome than from anywhere else. 30% of the papal pomp came out of the purses of imperial subjects, double of what Frenchmen or Englishmen were letting go south. No surprise that anti-papal and anti-clerical sentiment reached new heights, piling on to a tradition that went back to Henry IV, Frederick Barbarossa and Ludwig the Bavarian, to name just a few. Did it at least work? Did Friedrich receive a hero's welcome? His authority restored, his common peace renewed, and his imperial courts universally recognized? Well, not really. His failure to stop French mercenaries ravaging the southwest was still fresh in memory. No amount of imperial bling could distract from the fact that church taxes were going up, that the Council of Basel was dissolved, and that papal emissaries were picking up the most lucrative benefices. But then Friedrich didn't need to be loved, he just needed to be obeyed. He controlled all the Habsburg possessions, Upper, Lower and Further Austria, the Tyrol, the kingdoms of Bohemia and Hungary, a power base strong enough to force through whatever policies he wanted to implement. Right? Well, let's break it down. Friedrich did not own Upper and Further Austria, or Tyrol, nor was he King of Bohemia, or King of Hungary. The reason he controlled these lands was as guardian of his cousins, Sigismund of Tyrol and Ladislaus Postumus. Sigismund had reached maturity and taken ownership of Tyrol in 1446. That was a blow, but he still had the greatest of prizes, Ladislaus Postumus. Now, we have met this boy briefly in the last episode when he accomplished the greatest feat of his fairly short life, the fact that he was born. Born as the son of Albrecht of Habsburg, King of the Romans, King of Hungary, King of Bohemia, Archduke of Austria, Markgraf of Moravia, and. So before we push on with the story, let us trace what happened to him and the territories he had inherited up to the time Ladislaus came back from Rome with his beloved guardian. And we start with Hungary. When Ladislaus was born in February 1440, his father had been dead for 4 months. His mother, daughter of Emperor Sigismund, took up the fight to defend her infant son's inheritance, focusing first on Hungary. She had him crowned in the ancient coronation church by the correct archbishop and with the stolen crown of Saint Stephen, and all that at the tender age of 12 weeks. Hungary was a land dominated by about 60 magnate families who owned about 2/3 of the land. The church, controlled by the same people, owned another fifth, and the king barely 1/20. Peasants and burghers held what crumbs remained. The majority of these all-powerful Hungarian magnates rejected the idea of being ruled by a newborn, in particular since another attack by the Ottomans was looming. In the ensuing civil war, Ladislaus, his mother and her small group of supporters amongst the magnates were pushed back to Bratislava, which they could hold only thanks to the support by the Emperor Friedrich's brother, the Archduke Albrecht VI. Ladislaus' mother died in 1442, and, as per his father's testament and very much to the chagrin of Albrecht VI, the guardianship for the boy went to the Emperor Friedrich III. A big shift in Ladislaus' fortunes came in 1444 at the Battle of Varna. As we heard last time, the Habsburgs' rival for the Hungarian crown, King Ladislaus III of Poland, had been killed fighting the Ottomans. It took Poland 3 years to install Ladislaus' brother Casimir IV on the throne, meaning that there was no immediate successor in Hungary. A vacant throne plus the fear of a renewed Ottoman campaign forced the Hungarian factions to come together. In Hungary, two magnates dominated the scene. In one corner we have Ulrich, Count of Celje, great-uncle of Ladislaus, whose family had risen from Habsburg vassals to imperial princes ruling lands in modern Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Austria. They backed Ladislaus' claim right from the very beginning, but they were bitter enemies of the Habsburg Leopoldine line to which the Emperor Friedrich belonged. In the opposite corner we have John Hunyadi, a minor nobleman from Wallachia, which is modern-day Romania. He had made his career in the military, first in the service of Sigismund and then of Albrecht II. Once he was deployed in all of Sigismund's wars, including the fighting with the Hussites in Bohemia, it was in the wars with the Ottoman Turks that he had made his name, and had become immensely rich. At his death, he owned 2.3 million hectares, 28 castles, 57 towns, and 1,000 villages, mainly in the south of the country. Defense against the Ottomans was his main political aim, which is why he had backed Ladislaus III instead of the infant Ladislaus. For that, he was rewarded with command of Hungary's armies and the title of Voivode of Transylvania. His successful 1442 to 1444 campaign made him famous across Europe and forced the Turks into peace. In 1444 he followed the Crusader army into the defeat at Varna, a disaster for Christendom that cost him his king, but sufficiently hard fought to halt the Ottoman advance. With the king dead and no Polish successor in sight, most factions, Celje and Hunyadi, finally united behind Ladislaus. Ladislaus was still only 4 years old, so that a council of regents was established. With both John Hunyadi and Ulrich of Celje supporting Ladislaus' claim to the throne, one would assume the two men would now kiss and make up. But that would be misunderstanding the situation. These guys cared very little about Ladislaus and a lot more about who controlled Hungary. One of Hunyadi's first actions as regent of Hungary was to try to dislodge Ulrich of Celje from western Hungary, which he failed to do. From then on, the two men would be in near continuous armed conflict of varying intensity. In 1448, Hunyadi suffered a crushing defeat by the Ottomans, which weakened his prestige. Celje and Hunyadi now stood roughly equal, and both understood that whoever controlled young Ladislaus would control Hungary. We're heading into the 1450s, and Ladislaus is slowly but surely getting closer to maturity. When Hunyadi tried to make Friedrich III to hand over young Ladislaus by force, the emperor remained stubborn. So Hunyadi went for the second best option and agreed with Friedrich III that he would not send Ladislaus to Hungary before the boy was 18. Thus, although Ladislaus was king of Hungary in name, real power rested with John Hunyadi, and that was supposed to remain so until he was 18, that would be in 1458. Now, the situation in Bohemia was even more convoluted. By the end of the Hussite Wars, the country was on its knees. Around 10% of the population had perished. The German minority that had dominated trade and the lucrative mining business had been expelled. Without the contacts and expertise of German merchants and engineers, production had slowed down and trade had shrunk. The ultimate beneficiaries of the revolt were the mighty barons, who had seized almost the entirety of church and crown property. The radical Hussite factions, the Taborites and Orobites, had been defeated militarily and politically neutralized. So two groups remained, the old-school Catholics and the moderate Hussites going by the name of Utraquists. Their theological differences had narrowed down to the simple question whether the laity should be allowed to receive bread and wine during the Eucharist. Otherwise, the two factions were almost identical. Each of them were dominated by the barons, focused entirely on how they could enrich themselves at the expense of the cities and peasants. So in a cruel twist of fate, the revolution that had called for freedom and equality had ended with the return of serfdom. The only major export were mercenaries, hard-boiled by endless wars and adept at the use of handguns and Wagenburgs. During his brief reign, Ladislaus' father had relied on the old-school Catholics, whilst the Utraquists had tried to put Ladislaus III of Poland on the throne. And after Albrecht's death, the Catholics backed Ladislaus' claim, whilst the Utraquists did not put any candidate forward. They did not mind leaving the throne vacant for a while. After all, Bohemia had spent decades without a king. Between 1440 and 1444, the barons of both sides debated the issue at several diets. The compromise they came to was to accept Ladislaus as king, but not to crown him before he had reached maturity, aka not before they knew what kind of a guy he turned out to be. A delegation was sent to Emperor Friedrich III, requesting that the boy be raised in Bohemia, learn Czech, and become familiar with his future kingdom. Friedrich refused. The result was a stalemate. Ladislaus was recognized, but not ruling. Friedrich III, in his function as guardian of young Ladislaus, maintained links with the Bohemian barons. That involved, for one, Ulrich of Rosenberg, the long-standing leader of the Catholic party and largest landholder in Bohemia. But he also built a relationship with the Utraquists, in particular with a young man by the name of Georg of Podjebrad, who in 1444 took over the leadership of his party. Georg of Podjebrad was from a rich but not very old Bohemian family. His father had fought with Jan Žižka and the Hussites right from the very beginning of the revolt, and when he was 14 he took part in the Battle of Lipani when a coalition of Catholics and moderate Hussites defeated the radical Taborites. In 1438 he had fought against King Albrecht II. Now immediately after he had taken over as leader of the Utraquists, Bohemia descended once more into a civil war between the Catholics and the Hussites that lasted from 1444 to 1448. Georg of Podjebrad emerged victorious. The Diet elected him as Landverweser, aka regent of the kingdom, on behalf of the still absent Ladislaus. In 1451, Friedrich III recognized Georg of Podjebrad in his role as regent of Bohemia. These two men seemingly got on really well. Piccolomini, who was at the time Friedrich III's closest advisor, called Podjebrad, quote, greatly experienced in warfare and commendable for his gifts of body and mind, except that he is infected with the folly of communion under both species and Hussitism. Now, for the third part of Ladislaus' inheritance, Austria. Here, Friedrich III showed an unusual burst of energy. While he made no serious attempt to rule as regent in Bohemia or Hungary, in Austria he did, and with good reason. Of all the Habsburg lands, the Duchy of Austria was the most lucrative after the silver mines of Schwarz. How else was he to fund his various tasks as Holy Roman Emperor? Austria, or more precisely the guardianship over Ladislaus as Duke of Austria, came, however, with some heavy baggage. As many a buccaneering acquirer had found out to his or her detriment, a P&L never comes alone. There is always a balance sheet attached. And in the case of the Duchy of Austria, that balance sheet was very much out of balance. Ladislaus' father, Albrecht II, had borrowed from the estates on an epic scale. He used the money to wage war against the Hussites and to support his father-in-law Sigismund financially. There were the 400,000 florins on his wedding day to Elizabeth, but even more loans and gifts over the decades. Some of it was covered by taxation, but still a huge amount had been given to him in the form of loans. The estates now knocked on Friedrich's door and asked for their money back. Meanwhile, law and order in the duchy had fallen apart again. A decade had passed since Albrecht II had crushed the robber barons, and Friedrich's cautious approach, coupled with empty coffers, allowed the bandits to return. In 1450, things got so bad, Friedrich had to get out of his lethargy. He mobilized the ducal forces and captured 60 robbers, who he then had executed on the market square of Vienna. Still, the locals were not satisfied. They were further enraged when they heard about the agreement between Hunyadi and Friedrich that extended Ladislaus' guardianship until the boy was 18. Things were boiling over when on October 14th, 1451, Friedrich announced his departure for Rome for his imperial coronation and that he would take young Ladislaus with him. That same day, 39 lords and city representatives met at the castle of Mailberg, and they swore not to rest until their rightful lord, young Ladislaus, was released from the clutches of his warden and was residing again in the Hofburg in Vienna. The movement's leader was Ulrich von Eitzing, a member of the Bavarian lower nobility who had become immensely rich in the service of Albrecht II. Eitzing had managed Albrecht's finances from the very moment that Albrecht had taken control of the Duchy of Austria. Piccolomini painted him as a shrewd and money-grabbing parvenu. Others saw him in a more positive light. But what he definitely was a man who could whip up a crowd. A few weeks later, on December 12th, he mounted the pulpit that stood on the Am Hof Square, the largest square in medieval Vienna. His speech began by ventilating the well-known grievances of the estates, the unpaid debt, the bandits, and the absence of a duke in the Hofburg. And then he went on to claim that Friedrich had kept their true lord, young Ladislaus, in appalling conditions, leaving him more as a prisoner than as his ward. And then in a masterstroke of political theatre, he presented Ladislaus' sister, Elizabeth, wearing just rags, as proof of Friedrich's avarice and meanness. And that cut through. The Oath of Mailberg was signed by another 250 nobles, towns and cities. Vienna deposed the mayor that Friedrich had just approved and replaced him with a new one, who immediately renounced the city's allegiance. Friedrich was already on his way to Rome, and he briefly considered to return and quell the revolt. But then he decided to press on. For one, because it's never quite clear how long a window for an imperial coronation remains open. And also because Ladislaus was traveling with him to Rome, so whatever von Eitzing and his co-conspirators wanted to do with their rightful lord, well, they couldn't. Ladislaus was now 12 years old, and as far as anyone could make out, enjoyed his time in Rome, and had not suffered any deprivation from his older cousin, the emperor. All that now brings us back to June 1452. Friedrich returned to Wiener Neustadt with Ladislaus in tow. Ladislaus, who was the nominal king of Bohemia, the nominal king of Hungary, and the nominal Duke of Austria, ruled nothing. Wiener Neustadt was Friedrich's main residence. The town lies about 50 kilometers south of Vienna and at the time belonged to Styria rather than the Duchy of Austria. Never at ease in Vienna, Friedrich had built himself a castle palace there, decorated with curious monuments we will certainly return to later. And the castle stood within extensive gardens, where the emperor devoted himself to his favorite pastime, gardening, a hobby his contemporaries found even stranger than his cryptic mottos and imagery. And if he had hoped he would come back to a joyous reception as the crowned emperor, he was sorely disappointed. Ulrich von Eitzing's support in Austria had only grown in his absence. Amongst the many allies he found in the territories belonging to Ladislaus was Ulrich of Celje, the great uncle of little Ladislaus and major power player in Hungary. Ulrich had previously sought the support of Friedrich in his struggle against John Hunyadi for the supremacy in Hungary, but now he had joined the chorus of the discontent, demanding the emperor hands over young Ladislaus. For Friedrich, surrendering Ladislaus was impossible. It would have spelled the collapse of the power base he needed to be an effective emperor. When Friedrich III was elected in 1440, he was the most powerful Habsburg in decades, if not centuries. As the eldest son of Ernst the Iron, he owned Styria, Carinthia, and Carniola, as well as further Austria. As guardian of Sigismund of Tyrol, he controlled these rich lands, including the silver mines. And as guardian of Ladislaus, he ruled the core duchy of Austria and exercised the rights of his ward in Hungary and Bohemia. Now, by 1452, much of that had already slipped away. He had very reluctantly released Sigismund of Tyrol from his guardianship in 1446. He had given further Austria to his brother Albrecht VI after the debacle of the Armagnac Wars. I, by the way, made a mistake in one of the previous episodes where I ascribed the foundation of the University of Freiburg to Albrecht V. It was in fact Albrecht VI, the brother of Friedrich III, who founded it. Now back to the political issue at hand. If Friedrich III released Ladislaus from his guardianship, his resources would be limited to the duchies of Styria, Carinthia, and Carniola. Lovely places, and in case of Styria, quite prosperous, but nowhere near profitable enough to sustain imperial ambitions. So of course Friedrich III fought tooth and nail to keep hold of young Ladislaus and thereby his ability to rule the empire. No, of course not. He did send a force to Vienna to suppress the rebellion, but this effort came to naught, possibly because, again, he could not pay the soldiers, and when the two Ulrichs, or the one of Celje and the one of Eitzing, showed up before Wiener Neustadt with an army of 4,000 militiamen from Vienna, he caved. Ladislaus moved to Vienna, and for the next decade or so, Friedrich III barely ever left his beloved home in Wiener Neustadt, fretting, gardening, and making babies with the lovely Eleanor of Portugal. His inactivity was noticed all across the empire, and criticism of his inability or unwillingness to discharge the duties of a nominal leader of Christendom reached a first peak when Constantinople fell in 1453. Yet neither that seismic event nor unrest at home could drag the emperor out of his flower beds. We will explore the consequences of this long phase of imperial hibernation in the next 2 episodes. Today, though, we turn to young Ladislaus and the patchwork of lands he at least nominally ruled. Even though the Austrians, Hungarians, and Bohemians had formed a united front demanding the release of young Ladislaus, that was really the only point on which their interests aligned. Each party wanted to get hold of the precious rightful heir to their lands and anchor him in their culture and politics. Ulrich von Eitzing wanted him to remain in Austria to stabilize the duchy and to strengthen local authority. Georg of Podiebrad needed him in Prague to reconcile the Utraquists and the old-school Catholics under his regency. John Hunyadi ruled Hungary in the boy's name and wanted Ladislas to come to Buda to legitimize his de facto power. And Ulrich of Celje wanted that too, but for himself. Unsurprisingly, these 4 parties fell out almost immediately. On September 6th, Ladislaus entered Vienna in a grand procession organized by Ulrich von Eitzing. Only weeks later, a Hungarian delegation arrived, demanding that their king be handed over to them. In January 1453, Ladislaus travelled a short distance to Bratislava to receive the homage of his Hungarian subjects, but was days later whisked back to Vienna. The 2 protagonists in Vienna, Ulrich von Eitzing and Ulrich of Celje, clashed hardest. Ulrich of Celje urged the young man to come with him to Buda to wrestle effective control of the kingdom out of the hands of John Hunyadi. But Eitzing could not let that happen, because that would mean that the young boy would leave Vienna. In September 1453, he led armed men into the Hofburg at night, who apprehended Ladislaus, his sister, and Ulrich of Celje in their sleep. At sword point, the terrified boy was forced to dismiss his uncle from all Hungarian offices and order him to leave Vienna. The next day, Ladislaus confirmed John Hunyadi as his captain general in Hungary. Holding a blade to one's throat is rarely the way into a boy's heart, which may explain why Ladislaus was somewhat less enamored of Ulrich von Eitzing. Within weeks, the boy had disappeared to Moravia, where Georg of Podiebrad assembled the Bohemian barons to swear him allegiance, and on October 28th he was crowned King of Bohemia in St. Veit's Cathedral with the crown of St. Wenceslas. At last, he was formally invested in all his titles: King of Bohemia, King of Hungary, and Archduke of Austria. Though how much power came with them was another matter. After his departure from Vienna, the estates had established a council of regents that declared they would administer the state until Ladislaus turned 20. In Hungary, John Hunyadi braced the kingdom for the next Ottoman assault that was as inevitable as the drizzle in London. And in Bohemia, where Ladislaus now resided, real power still lay with Georg of Podiebrad, whose influence grew all the greater with the young king under his roof. Now into this already unstable situation came another wave of Ottoman attacks. Pope Nicholas V had called for a new crusade after the fall of Constantinople, but responses were tepid. Friedrich III convened 3 imperial diets between 1454 and 1456, but attended only one, the one held in his hometown of Wiener Neustadt. These diets painted the now familiar picture of a dithering, indecisive, and as some claimed, cowardly monarch. Whether there was indeed any such thing does not really matter, because the perception stuck and the facts spoke for themselves. When the Ottomans ready to strike Serbia and Hungary, no help came from the empire. The Hungarians, bitterly divided, rallied around their greatest soldier, John Hunyadi. The enemy's target was Belgrade, the gateway to Central Europe. The city stands at the junction of the Danube and the Sava, just upriver from the Iron Gates. Every crusade to the east that had not travelled by ship via Venice, Genoa, or Pisa had passed this way. Now the Ottomans were coming the other direction. Belgrade had always been a heavily fortified town, but between 1404 and 1427 it had been turned into one of the most extensive and most advanced military complexes in Europe. On the hill in the centre of town stood the fortress, which was surrounded by the walled upper town, which had the garrisons and armories, and then the lower town was surrounded by a third wall with only 4 major gates, and then 2 sides were protected by the rivers Sava and Danube. Sultan Mehmet II, conqueror of Constantinople, came prepared. He brought 22 great cannon, somewhere between 20 and 200 ships to seal the river, and somewhere between 30,000 and 100,000 men, a host nearly as large and as well equipped as the one that had breached the Theodosian walls. Against him stood 7,000 men inside the city of Belgrade and 2 relief armies coming down the Danube River. Of the relief forces, one was Hunyadi's professional army of veterans, perhaps 10 to 12,000 men hardened by decades of fighting. They had campaigned with him from 1442 to 1444, bloodied the Ottomans at Varna, and survived the disaster of 1448. The second was a force of roughly 30,000 peasant crusaders, inspired and rallied by a fiery Franciscan preacher, Giovanni Capistrano. Few had proper weapons, many carried pitchforks and flails. They did, however, possess a makeshift flotilla, perhaps 200 small ships, to challenge the Ottoman blockade. The battle became part of the Hungarian national myth and was recently turned into a Netflix series called The Rise of the Raven, based itself on a series of best-selling books. Mehmet II reached Belgrade before Hunyadi and Capistrano. He encircled the city by land and sealed the river. His giant cannon started pounding the town's outside wall in preparation for a final assault. Hearing of Hunyadi and Capistrano's approach, the Sultan might have intercepted him. But he didn't. He gambled he could take the city first. And he was wrong. When Hunyadi arrived, Belgrade was still holding out. To reach the city, he launched a daring river assault. In a 5-hour battle, his ships broke through the Ottoman blockade and resupplied the garrison. That was a setback, but Mehmet never intended to starve the city, but to storm it. For that he needed to break the walls with his cannon, which were now pounding the walls day and night. The defenders, who had cannon of their own, responded in kind and killed the commander of the Ottoman forces, Karaka Pasha. On July 21, 1456, a breach opened, and Mehmet sent in his elite troops, the Janissaries. In a running street battle, the Ottoman forces hacked their way towards the center of town, one house and one street at a time. Hunyadi ordered the defenders to gather all flammable materials and build barricades of tarred woods throughout the city. And wherever the Janissaries broke through the barricades, he ordered his archers to set these wooden barricades alight. A wall of fire swept through the city, cutting the attackers off. Surrounded and isolated, the Janissaries were overwhelmed and massacred. Meanwhile, their comrades fighting on the other side of the wall of fire were pinned down by the Hungarian relief forces and suffered heavy losses too. Now by nightfall, both sides withdrew to their camps. The next morning, discipline in the Hungarian camp collapsed. Capistrano's crusaders poured from the gates to plunder abandoned Ottoman positions and stumbled into fresh fighting. More and more men joined on either side until it turned into a full-scale battle. Capistrano could no longer hold back, and the peasant crusaders all stormed out of Belgrade. Hunyadi had no choice but to follow. So he struck for the Ottoman artillery, expecting the Ottomans to concentrate on defending their cannon, and with it their only chance to take Belgrade. And that eased the pressure on the Crusaders, who managed to break through the Ottoman lines. They captured the enemy camp, and Hunyadi took their artillery. Mehmet II now rallied his troops and led them personally in a counterattack. Encouraged by their Sultan's bravery, his beaten-up forces recovered and took back their camp. But they could go no further. Mehmet II had been injured himself in the attack, and the cannon were lost. In the night, they buried their dead, put their wounded onto carts, and headed back to Constantinople. The road to Hungary remained closed. Belgrade had held. The Ottoman tide would not reach it again for another 70 years. The victory at Belgrade sent shockwaves across Europe. Pope Calixtus III, the first of the Borgia popes, proclaimed a perpetual thanksgiving. Every church bell would ring at midday, calling Christians to pray 3 Our Fathers and 1 Ave Maria in gratitude for deliverance from the Turks. That midday bell still rings today, though its origins have largely been forgotten. As for the victors, John Hunyadi and Giovanni Capistrano, neither lived to enjoy their success. Both died within weeks, victims of the bubonic plague that swept through the Crusader camp. With John Hunyadi gone, Hungary fell into political limbo. The young king Ladislaus had left for the safety of Vienna when news of the Ottoman advance had reached Buda, but now, after the great victory, he returned. At 16, crowned and recognized, he was expected to take full control of his realm and appoint his great-uncle Ulrich of Celje as the new captain general in Hunyadi's place. The dead hero's sons, Laszlo and Matthias, saw danger in every move. Their father and Ulrich of Celje had been bitter enemies, and they knew the new captain general would come for them, or at least for their money. And they weren't wrong. Ulrich of Celje soon demanded repayment of fabricated debts and the surrender of the Hunyadi estates. Now that claim failed, but the hostility deepened. In November 1456, Ulrich and King Ladislaus travelled to Belgrade to take possession of the fortress commanded by Laszlo Hunyadi. As they ascended the ramparts, their men quartered in the upper town. The next morning, Laszlo struck. Ulrich of Celje was found dead in his room. At first, the terrified king feigned reconciliation, even promising the Hunyadi widow that their sons were safe. But once back in Buda, he had them seized. Laszlo was condemned for murder and publicly executed. Matthias was imprisoned. For the first time, Ladislaus Postumus had acted like a monarch, ruthless, decisive, unflinching. But power in Hungary rested not with the crown, but with the 60 great magnate families, and their reaction would decide whether the boy king ruled or merely reigned. Ladislaus did not stick around to find out what happens to a man who kills the son of Europe's savior and Hungarian national hero. He fled to Bohemia, taking Matthias Hunyadi with him as a hostage. In Prague, his regent Georg of Poděbrad cared less about judicial niceties and welcomed him with great royal honours, and arranged a glittering marriage to a French princess. Days before the nuptials, Ladislaus Postumus, King of Hungary, King of Bohemia and Archduke of Austria, keeled over and died. Rumours of poison spread and persisted for centuries until in 1984 his grave was opened and his skeleton examined. Ladislaus Postumus had died of leukemia. And thus, most unexpectedly, the boy king, the plaything of his magnates and hope of his many subjects, was gone. Who was to inherit those crowns and duchies? His closest male relative was the Emperor Friedrich III. So, this must be the moment the famous Austro-Hungarian monarchy came into being. Friedrich III got to rule most of Central Europe. His money problems are now over, and the empire can finally be reformed. Oh boy, oh boy. Next week we will see how this is so not at all happening. And if you find supporting this show beats rooting for Friedrich III, go to historyofthegermans.com/support, where you can find various options to keep the history of the Germans on the road and advertising free.